Hello, everyone. This is Anthony. Welcome to a brief lecture on what is logic for our class. As always, I try to keep these lectures to a minimum. Sometimes, as I've mentioned before, they might go a little bit longer than intended, but nonetheless, I try to be brief. Please also be sure that you have read chapter 1 of the logic text that was assigned, what is logic, so that the concepts and terms that I'm about to discuss will make sense. So in this chapter, we give a brief overview of a few things: basic notions in logic, analysis of arguments, logic and philosophy, and then some exercises. This lecture will just focus on basic notions about arguments and what logic is. So let's start with basic notions, or section 1. So reasoning is paramount to philosophy as well as everyday life. And while philosophy is difficult to give a precise definition of, one human activity almost universally associated with and prized within philosophy is reasoning. Reasoning, as I just mentioned, is applicable to all types of analytic disciplines and especially problem solving. Reasoning is something that we do on a daily basis, whether it's to solve a puzzle or figure out what's wrong with your car or an appliance, or it's also used quite notably in argumentation. So reasoning at its most general level is about making claims and backing them up with reasons or evidence, and acting in accord with reasons and beliefs, drawing inferences from that available evidence, and so on. Now, obviously, this process can be done well or poorly, correctly or incorrectly. So logic is the discipline that aims to distinguish good reasoning from bad reasoning. So we really want to be careful here, because good reasoning is not necessarily the same as effective reasoning. So one thing I like to often point out is that people can be very persuasive and very effective with the claims that they make, or the language that they use, or the kinds of persuasive tactics that have been employed. That's not the same thing as giving good reasoning. Bad reasoning, as we know from history, can nonetheless be motivating and effective. So hence the picture on the left-hand side of Nazi Germany, I think serves as a very good illustration that people can give very effective and even persuasive speeches or pieces of reasoning, but that doesn't make the reasoning good. So there are disciplines where we do talk about effective and persuasive reasoning. We talk about such speech in communication or speech classes, but in philosophy and in logic, we're focused on reasoning from a different perspective. In logic, the standard of goodness about reasoning is not effectiveness in the sense of persuasiveness, but rather correctness according to logical rules which have been stipulated. So logic is a very vast and historically motivating field of study. I myself have spent a lot of time studying logic, or logics, I should say. They're very interesting. There are a lot of overlaps between logic and things like computer science, computer languages and programming, artificial intelligence, as well as more practical applications for fields like law, even science, and really just being a good reasoner. So in logic, we study the rules and techniques that allow us to distinguish good or correct reasoning from bad or incorrect reasoning. And any logic, or logic in general, must formulate precise standards for evaluating reasoning and develop methods for applying those standards to particular instances or cases. So for example, the diagram in the upper right-hand side of the slide might look a little foreign to us, but essentially what this is a logic proof. So just like we have proofs in things like mathematics, logic is also in the business of stipulating and specifying what the proper or effective inferences or moves that we can make, just like we would stipulate such rules in, say, a board game or a card game or things like that, which moves are allowed and which moves aren't. The same thing holds in logic and reasoning overall. So another notion that we should introduce is the notion of a proposition or statement. So reasoning involves claims or statements, making them and backing them up with reasons, and also drawing out their consequences. So a proposition or propositions are the things that we claim, state, and assert. They can be true or false, but not both, according to standard classical logic. They are, in other words, declarative sentences. Of course, though, not all sentences are declarative. Interrogative and imperative sentences do not assert anything and are thus not propositions under this definition. So non-propositions then are sentences that are not either true or false, so do not constitute propositions based on this definition. So if we're thinking about some examples of propositions, pretty much any declarative sentence counts as a proposition. Any claim or statement that asserts that something is or is not the case satisfies the definition of a proposition. So obviously scientific claims might come to mind. Mars is the fourth planet from our sun, or even things like Mars is the third planet from the sun. It doesn't have to be true. It just has to be either true or false, but not both. All art is beautiful, or even ethical claims would constitute propositions on that definition. It is wrong to eat meat. Any sentence that is in principle either true or false, but not both, that's declarative, would satisfy the standard philosophical definition of a proposition. So we might be asking ourselves, well, aren't all sentences in English propositions? No, we often ask questions, right? What would you like for lunch? What time would you like to eat lunch? Or exclamations or commands are also not true or false. And hopefully we can think linguistically how such sentences are used. We're not asserting something when we ask what time would you like to eat lunch. We're merely asking a question. Or even greetings like good morning, good afternoon, or good morning, right? Anytime that we greet somebody, we're not declaring that something is or is not the case. Or commands, right? Don't eat Tide Pods, or read more books, or we should exercise. Those aren't sentences that are either true or false, right? So thus they would not be propositions. So the reason that we want to define some of these terms is because they are used in reasoning. We can separate sentences from the propositions they express or the information content or meaning of a statement. So this is why we use a general term proposition that's supposed to hold even between languages. For example, in English, the sentence, I am hungry, expresses the same proposition as io ho fame in Italian, which is literally different. Interestingly, Romance languages, as I'm sure some of you know, this literally translates into I have hunger, right? So in Romance languages, you don't say I am hungry, you say I have hunger. So even though they don't translate literally the same, they express the same proposition, right? So they're two different sentences and they're in different languages. We still want to say that they express the same proposition, regardless of whether I'm speaking Italian or English. So arguments play the fundamental role and are of fundamental importance in philosophy, as well as other endeavors, of course, like I mentioned before, science and law. And it will be the primary focus of our course. Since reasoning is a big part of philosophy, arguments will consequently be a big part of what we do in our class. So this is the fundamental unit of reasoning that we are focused on. And in logic, by argument, we don't mean a disagreement, a shouting match, something like that. Rather, it's a precise term that we can define as follows. An argument is a set of propositions or statements one of which, the conclusion, is supposed to be supported by the others, what we call the premises. So in arguments, if we're reasoning by drawing an inference from a set of statements or propositions, so by the way, we'll use statements and propositions interchangeably, that's fine, then the inference we draw is the conclusion of an argument, and the statements from which it's drawn are called the premises. Okay, so we really want to make that distinction clear here. The thing or statement that we're trying to support in a piece of reasoning is called the conclusion. And the way we support it is by giving reasons or premises that support the conclusion. So not all reasoning is good, however, right? And that should be hopefully obvious to us. A bad argument, very roughly speaking, is one where the premises fail to support the conclusion, while a good argument's premises actually do support the conclusion. So this leads to the second section, analysis of arguments. So if we look at this passage, which is similar to the assigned reading, we'll notice that there is an argument. So it says, you shouldn't eat at McDonald's. Why? First of all, because they pay their workers very low wages. Second, the animals that provide their meat are raised in deplorable conditions. Finally, the food is extremely unhealthy. So we're not asking at this point whether we agree with this argument or whether we should talk about some of the information that's in the argument. The goal is to first recognize whether or not we have an argument. Is there a statement or proposition in this passage that is being supported by the others? And we see that in this passage, the overall statement that the author or speaker is trying to convince us of is the very first sentence, right? You shouldn't eat at McDonald's. And then after that, there are reasons that are given that are intended to support the conclusion, which is that sentence or that statement. Here is another argument that's more similar to what is often discussed in philosophy classes, God's existence. So here's an argument. The universe is vast and complex, and yet does it not also display an astonishing degree of order? The planets orbit the sun according to regular laws, and animals' minutest parts are arranged precisely to serve their purposes. Such order and complexity cannot arise at random. The universe must therefore be the product of a designer of enormous power and intellect, whom we call God. So now that we've seen two examples of arguments, the first thing we want to do when we start analyzing arguments is to identify the conclusion first. So in order to do that, it's helpful to ask yourself, what is this person trying to convince me to believe by saying these things? Or to phrase it differently, what is the ultimate point of this passage? Once we've identified the conclusion, then we can start asking what kind of support or premises this person or speaker offers in support of that conclusion. So to identify the premise or premises of an argument, it's helpful to ask ourselves, what are the reasons this person is offering to convince me to believe their conclusion? How are they supporting their conclusion? And that's a fundamental task of logic, philosophy, and so many other disciplines. So if we go back, I'll go back quickly. If we ask ourselves with this example, what is the conclusion? Then which sentence is the overall, which sentence is this speaker or writer trying to convince us overall? There seems to be a lot of sentences. Is it the second one? Well, from before, we already know that questions are not propositions or statements, so it can't be this one, right? Because this is what we might call a rhetorical question, because this person does think that the universe does display an astonishing degree of order. Is it this sentence? No, we actually notice that the very last sentence, the universe must therefore be the product of a designer, whom we call God. There's also a word that tips us off, which we'll talk a little bit more about. So in this passage, in this argument, the conclusion is the last sentence because it is being supported by the other sentences. Okay, so one thing that we'll do and is often done in philosophy is to explicate or present the argument. Some books and some philosophers call it one or the, it's really the same thing. So to explicate or present an argument is to state explicitly their premises and conclusions on separate lines. So it's a common convention, not just in philosophy, but as I say, in other disciplines as well, to list out the premises in order, in numerical order, and then separate them, sometimes with a bar, sometimes with other little symbols. It really doesn't ultimately matter so long as we explicate it consistently. But we've taken the original argument that we've looked at and we've explicated it or presented it here. So we list the premise, the first premise here: McDonald's pays their workers very low wages. Premise 2, the animals that provide McDonald's meat are raised in deplorable conditions. The third reason or third premise is McDonald's food is very, it's the overall statement that is being supported. Therefore, you shouldn't eat at McDonald's. So we've listed the conclusion at the end. So we will explicate and present arguments throughout the quarter, and also practice doing this so that we can explicate and present and defend really our own arguments that we'll have the freedom in formulating ourselves. So here's that second argument about God's existence, explicated and or presented. Premise 1 was the universe is vast and complex. Premise 2, the universe displays an astonishing degree of order. Premise 3, the planets orbit the sun according to regular laws. Premise 4, animals, minutest parts, are arranged precisely to serve their purposes. Premise 5, such order and complexity cannot arise at random. And then the conclusion, that the universe must be the product of a designer of enormous power and intellect, whom we call God. So arguments can have 5 premises, they can have 4 premises. Sometimes they can only have one premise. At the very least, it must have one premise, right? There must be at least one reason that's offered to support another claim, the conclusion. So again, to explicate or present an argument, first find its conclusion, then the premises, and look for what we call indicator words. These are words in our language, English, that indicate a premise or a reason is being offered. So common words are in view of the fact, assuming that, because, since, due to the fact that, for. There are other ones, but those are some common ones. Whereas conclusion indicator words that are common in English: consequently, as a result, thus, hence, therefore, so, or in conclusion. And we can even put together a simple argument using just these words, right? With one premise and only one conclusion. Because Anthony is hungry, thus he should eat, or therefore he should eat, right? That's so, there is one premise and one conclusion, but not a very complex argument, but an argument nonetheless. Sometimes arguers omit propositional content necessary to fully capture the argument's reasoning. Such unstated propositions are called anthomemes. So these are things that need to be presented in order to fully complete the argument. So here's an example: there cannot be an all-loving God because so many innocent people all over the world are suffering. There's something that's being unstated here that, if it were present, would make the argument more complete. So if we were to state the unstated premise here after looking over this argument, we would get something like this: the addition of premise 2. An all-loving God would not allow innocent people to suffer. So we notice that this is actually missing in the original argument, but if we include it, it completes the argument and gives a much fuller picture of the intent of the arguer. So logical analysis also shows us the relationship between premises and conclusion. So consider this argument from the book. America's invasion of Iraq was an act of aggression, not self-defense. In addition, it was unreasonable to expect that the benefits of the war would outweigh the inevitable horrors it would unleash. Therefore, the Iraq War was not a just war. So here, what we're doing is we're actually numbering every statement. This makes the process of analyzing passages and analyzing arguments even more precise and more concrete, because then we can zero in on individual sentences and we can start analyzing what's been given to us, and then go from there where we can judge the argument and whether it's a good one. So in this argument, the conclusion is statement 3. We notice that there's a conclusion indicator word, therefore, and this is the overall statement that's being supported, right? So propositions 1 and 2 support the conclusion 3, and they do so independently. So what does that mean? It means that each of these premises gives us a reason for believing that the war was unjust, and each stands as a reason even if we were to suppose that the other were not true. So this is what we call independent premises. In other words, what we could do is we'd still have an argument if we got rid of 2 and just had 1 and 3. Or we'd still have an argument if we kept 2 but got rid of 1, right? That's what we would call independent reasons or independent premises. And this is where we could even diagram arguments. If we were another class, we could spend some more time on this, but I actually find this process can be quite helpful when I'm trying to think or map out the person's reasoning process, when I'm trying to understand what leads to what or what kind of support is given. Philosophers and logicians often will do what's called argument mapping. And this is especially helpful for more complex arguments, but the Iraq War example from the previous page could be mapped out this way. We have 1 and 2, which are independent, and they both give reason to think that 3 is true, okay? So they get their own arrows because they're independent. They're independent premises, okay? So if we look at these 2 examples, I want to make it clear what the difference between an argument and a non-argument is. So if we see this example, law enforcement in the city is a complete failure. Incidents of serious crime have doubled. Okay, this is an argument because there's a sentence or statement that is supported by another. The conclusion is law enforcement in the city is a complete failure. Why should we think that's true? Well, because incidents of serious crime have doubled. So this is an argument. But obviously not all passages contain arguments. We have to ask ourselves, is there a reason or reasons given to support another statement? Sometimes people just rant or give opinions, right? Think of social media. Not everything that we read is an argument. Sometimes people are just giving their opinions or reporting things or recounting some part of their day, right? So if we had something like law enforcement in the city is a complete failure, nothing seems to work in the city anymore, we've seen this kind of bad situation in other cities, right? There's no one statement that's being supported by the other. So we have to ask ourselves when we're trying to determine if there's an argument, is there one statement that's being supported by the others? And if the answer is no, then there is no argument. So let me leave it there for this lecture, and we'll continue our discussion of logic in the next lecture. Thanks for listening, and please let me know if you have any questions in the meantime.